I'm really a big fan of thinking about governance before you get started too far in any kind of a project. So, a little background about me. I'm an information architect and business analyst, and I spend most of my time helping organizations build intranets and collaboration solutions that deliver business value, that deliver business results. And I tend to spend most of my time focused on how are we going to create a solution that adds business value and protects users from making mistakes. So a lot of governance is about making sure there are no sharp edges in your solution. But in addition, we need to have a governance plan, especially for Microsoft Teams, to just keep everything in check, to make sure that we are not creating duplicate teams or teams that have the same purpose or that could effectively be aligned, to make sure we're managing the proliferation of teams so that they have a start and a finish. And if we have teams that are not being used, that we have a clear mechanism for getting rid of them. Having a great governance plan shouldn't be looked at as being something restrictive. You really want to look at it as something that is going to provide the guardrails to help people be effective. So it does all of these wonderful things, and it can also really simplify the experiences for your users and admins. So I don't think anyone should be afraid of the G word, even if it means that you're applying some of it retroactively. And so, of course, it would be better to start out with a great governance plan. But in the past year, many of us have implemented teams rather quickly. And so, for some of us, let's just say that that ship may have sailed. So, I think what we want to talk about a little bit today is to think about what we need to do to understand governance and get back on track if we're kind of a little bit out there already. And the fundamental thing that you need to think about when it comes to governance for Teams is that Teams is not alone. Teams is part of a suite or a family of software, and some of the decisions that you make for Teams are going to affect other members of the family. And so while our goal is to make sure that we put those guardrails on all of the different places that we want to make sure are in place so that users don't get hurt, so that we are protecting the information that is important to protect for the organization and making it easy as possible for people to do their jobs. Some of the governance actions will be things that users need to decide on their own. And I think of this aspect of governance as kind of another G word. It's more about guidance, ensuring that team owners and team members have a good understanding of how to make good decisions in places where they have a choice. So we're going to try and put guardrails on all the places where we don't want to allow anyone to make a mistake. And by the way, if those decisions were the same for every organization, we'd only have to do this once, and Microsoft would just build them into the team's product. But every organization has their own sort of combination of risk and business needs. So there is no one size fits all. But what we have learned from experience is that if you lock things down too much, people will find a way to break free. I mean, information is going to flow when it wants to flow. And if you open things up too much, you could end up with the wild, wild west. So at the end of the day, good governance is about balance, providing the right guardrails and the right training so that people can make good choices. And you're basically sort of balancing too many restrictions with too much openness in order to create the best combination of these building blocks for your organization. I couldn't possibly touch on every single nuanced decision that you can make in Microsoft Teams. So what I want to spend the next few minutes talking about is what are those big decisions that you need to make, those big building blocks, decisions that admins need to make because they will impact users, and decisions that users need to understand in order to be effective. And there's a lot of different knobs and dials that you can turn. And if you really want to learn about every single possible knob and dial that you can turn in Microsoft Teams, I'm going to point you to a resource that I've been curating for the last 15 years. And that is my Microsoft 365 governance questions document. This collection of questions incorporates all of the decisions that you can make related to governance for almost every aspect of, let's call it, the collaborative part of Microsoft 365. So I focus on SharePoint, Teams, Yammer, and OneDrive, that area, and you will find screenshots of all the different sort of knobs and dials in the admin center, which oftentimes the people making governance decisions or who need to be making governance decisions have no idea what the options are. So I try to present the options in a series of questions guided in a series of topic focused meetings so that you can understand, well, what decisions should we make first? And then what should we focus on next? And which decisions really need to have some extra special people involved, like HR or legal. And so the conversation, I think a lot of times governance is about making good decisions, is about having the right conversations. And what you'll find in that document is a framework for having the conversations. What I want you to do, or what I've learned is the best way to deal with the answers to those decisions, is to create what I call a user resource center, a place where people can go to find both training and guidance on how to be effective with this suite of tools. And I will hopefully have time to show you of how a demonstration of how you can do that and deliver it right inside Microsoft Teams. So fundamentally, every single knob and dial you can possibly turn is summarized in that document, including links to all the different places in Microsoft Docs where you can find it. So as I said, the most important thing to remember about Microsoft Teams is the first building block, which is P is for provisioning. And unfortunately, it's complicated. Teams doesn't live by itself, as you probably know. Microsoft 365 Groups provides the membership service for Teams. When you create a team, you are creating a group. And when you create a group, you get stuff to go with it. You get a SharePoint team site. You get OneNote inside that team site. If you're looking for it, it lives inside Assets. Don't ask me why. You get Planner, and you get an email address and a calendar for that team. So Teams is really not alone. And so the group provides the related services for the team. And so when you are provisioning a team, or if you decide you're going to restrict provisioning of a team, you need to understand that you will have an impact on the other members of the family, because ultimately the provisioning decision comes down to who can create a group. And you really have a couple of options. One is you can limit who can create a team. And in doing so, you need to figure out, well, if I want to limit it, which is totally possible, who then becomes the gatekeeper, or what process becomes the gatekeeper for ensuring that we get the right amount of teams, or just the right teams. And that process is going to be different for every organization. You can do something as simple as having an email, a button link to IT. You can, hide the ability to create a team from the Teams app itself, and then create a place where people can request a team either within Teams using the Teams app template, or anything else that you want to create to enable people to request a team. And then you need to figure out what the process is to make that happen. You can also use a third-party product to kind of encapsulate the Teams creation process and apply all of the governance policies and templates and everything else you might want to do. So there's a couple of different ways to go if you want to limit. You could also leave it open. And my feeling about opening teams, allowing anyone in the organization to create a team, doesn't mean you're avoiding governance, but if you're going to open it up, it's also not a bad decision, but you will still need to then have a way to govern after the fact. So in one of the organizations in which I work, we have a post-team creation process. Anyone can create a team. We have a post process that sends an email out saying, hey, you just created a team. Are you aware of our naming conventions? Did you name it according to our conventions? If you didn't, do not pass go, do not collect $200, go back delete your team, recreate it with a new name. Here's the links to the training that you might need to be effective in your job. And so again, you do not have to block it. You can open it up, but no matter how you're going to provision teams, you're going to want to make sure that you have some governance before or after the team is created. And the reason you really want to think about how you're going to do this is because of how much is affected if you restrict the creation of a group. So you need to figure out just how am I going to manage this? By the way, limiting who can create a team doesn't necessarily eliminate duplicate teams, by the way. It just means that because duplicate teams can be created, they just get a funky name that you didn't anticipate. So you still may need some kind of human intervention to make sure that we don't already have a team for this purpose. So the reason you want to pay attention to naming conventions, so the second building block, N is for naming, is because Teams shares a namespace with the rest of your SharePoint sites. And if you're going to auto provision Teams, you're going to be choosing a path or if you're going to allow people to create teams, you have to sort of select a path for what will be the site, what's going to be the path for the URL that's created for the SharePoint site that lives behind the team. And guess what? That same URL experience is going to be shared with your intranet. So if someone creates a team called IT, you cannot create a communication site on the intranet called IT because that namespace will already be reserved. And so what will happen is that SharePoint's not going to say, no, you can't have it. It will create IT2. And I cannot tell you how many times a team has been created with a name that actually should have been an intranet site name. And so we're going to get this really weird collection of URLs. And if that doesn't bother your organization, then it's totally fine. But if it does, then you want to think about what should we be doing to make sure that we don't have that conflict when it comes to names. And again, there's no right answer for what the best way to do this is. If you do want to have an automated naming process, you can set that up if you have the right licenses in Teams, so that if I try to create a team, either through an automated provisioning process or directly through Teams, you can append a suffix or a prefix to the name so that there will be some element of control. Or you can deal with the whole thing as a training exercise, which is what we're doing in the clients where we have open Teams creation. So you just, again, have a place where you've defined what your naming conventions are, and if someone doesn't follow it, you introduce an intervention, if you will. So for naming options, if you're going to automate, you can do, as I said, a prefix and a suffix. I highly recommend that you choose a suffix, not a prefix. And the reason for that is because if the name is appended as a suffix when you're scrolling through a long list of teams, either in the admin center or if you're a member of a large number of teams, you'll be focused on the name of the team, not the appendix that shows up at the end of the team. So not the prefix. So you'll actually be able to see your teams that you're part of more effectively. There's a great question as I understand it, renaming a team doesn't rename the underlying group or the SharePoint site collection. That is true, which is another real reason that you want to have a good naming convention so that you do not have to worry about renaming the team. The other possibility is that you could rename the SharePoint site collection and then potentially have an impact on the team if you use the URL rename feature. So my best advice to you is have naming conventions, make sure that they are well communicated so that for the most part, the names can stay consistent. It may not matter. This is the thing about the SharePoint site behind the team. The URL for that SharePoint site may not really matter, because if your users are primarily using the Teams interface, they may actually not know that SharePoint lives behind Teams. That could be totally okay. Where I've noticed that this is creates the biggest amount of conflict is from organizations that are coming from a SharePoint world moving into Teams. People who are entering the Microsoft 365 space from a Teams perspective don't really quite understand that the documents don't live in Teams, and they may not need to know that. And so, again, naming conventions can solve a lot of this if you think this through before you start creating lots and lots of teams. And again, if you're going to have naming conventions, then you need to make sure that there is guidance that people can easily find to understand the implications of choosing a good name for your team. The next thing you want to think about, so now we've created and we've decided how we're going to name our teams. The next thing you're pretty much going to always think about is who can be a member. And G is for guest access. As I said, Teams is part of a family. So at the root of your tenant, at the Azure AD level, you have a setting that you choose to decide whether you can have guests in the tenant. I have another client that's a financial institution, and they block guest sharing at the Azure AD level. If you do that, forget all these other slides about guest access because they're irrelevant. Because if you block it at the top, you can't open it later on in the food chain. So the first part of that decision is made, do we allow guests in our tenant at all? I hope in general that the answer to that question is yes, because if you don't, I can promise you that your users will find another way to collaborate externally, or you will need another tool in which to do that, an approved tool in which to do that, because you're still going to want to take care of protecting your information and making sure that it's manageable. So first decision you're going to make is, can you have a guest in the tenant? And then after that, you're deciding, can we have guests in groups? And Teams and SharePoint are really at kind of the same level. They're managed independently because you could potentially allow guests in one and not in the other, but you really do want those decisions to align so that the experience can be cohesive and consistent. And so what you're basically deciding is who can be a member of a team and where do I need to introduce that? By default, guest access is open in your tenant, but you may have already closed some of these doors. And so what you're going to want to do is make sure that you have sort of checked, are the places that need to be open? You can always lock down an individual team, and you can do this with policy settings or an individual SharePoint site, so that on specific sites, you are not allowed to have guests. And that, to me, is a healthier way to look at guest access, to allow it where it is necessary and lock it down on those highly confidential teams where you don't want guests to be a member. I'm going to take a little breath and see if there's any questions, so please feel free to put them in the chat. Here's a slide that you can just look at. I'm not going to drain this for you, but it's just a table that you can look at to say sort of what's the difference between having guests and external users in my team. I'm really, by the way, I should have prefaced this, that some of my slides are meant to be looked at, others are meant to be read, which is why I'm giving you access to all the slides. What I really want to introduce is the topics and to give you a takeaway that so you can look at how can I make some of these decisions. So E is for exploration. And at the end of the day, the way I think about teams is that in general, a team represents a group of people who are coming together to get work done. When the work is over, the team typically disbands and people move on to other teams or work on other things. So now if we are using Teams for collaboration, we do want to think about, well, when the team work for that activity is over, what do we want to do with that entire team? Do we want to auto expire teams that are no longer being used? Do we want to renew teams that are actively being used? And how often do we want to check usage against those teams? And so very important to think about what happens at the end of a collaboration lifecycle. If you're going to do auto expiration, which again requires a specific license, if you have Microsoft 365 E3 or E5, you will have all the right licensing. If you have Office 365 E3, you will need to make sure that you also have Azure AD Premium P1 for every user that is a member of a group in order to auto expire, to automate some of these policies. Most important thing to consider if you are going to auto expire a team is, do you have a retention policy in place? Because at some point, auto-expiring a team could result in content being deleted. And what you want to do is make these decisions holistically and say, well, are there some type of teams or some type of content more that we need to preserve the content for a specific period of time? Let's make sure we have those retention policies in place, because retention will override expiration or deletion. So if you have a retention policy in place, you will not, it'll look to users like things are deleted, but they're not really deleted because you've got that retention policy. So you do want to think about that. The next fundamental building block is, how can we make it easy for people to create consistent experiences in teams and just not have to think so hard when they're creating things? So C is for configuration. And one of the really great things is in teams is the ability to model a new team after an existing team, or model a new team after a template that you've created for your organization. And so that's the kind of thing that we want you to consider as part of governance. Do we want to have a standard template for a project or for an IT project, sort of a subset of the organization? What kind of apps do we want to make available to people? You can expose them or not expose them. You can choose what you want. You also want to think about what features can people have in our different types of teams. Can users create private channels? If so, who can create private channels? Anyone, or just the owner of the team? You want to think about the default meeting policies. All these kind of features and templates can actually be packaged up into a policy related to how you classify your teams, so that you could say, hey, this team is of type highly confidential, and therefore no guests are allowed. All the content is going to be retained. Only owners can create private channels. So you can really granularly decide, based on different types of teams, what you want people to be able to do. And so that leads right into C, is for compliance. So what do we want to do in terms of classifying our team? What data retention policies do we have on chat and channel messages? I worked in an organization one time where they didn't want any chat messages to persist longer than a day from a legal perspective, because they didn't want them to be discoverable. And so one of the challenges with a decision like that, or an intent like that, is what happens if someone misses a chat message? Is it just going to go away? And so what you really want to think about is what is both practical and required in your industry and for your organization to ensure that you can get work done effectively. And so you want to think about individual chat messages, and they may have a different retention policy than channel messages. Where they ended up landing is that one-to-one or one-to-group chat messages have a much shorter retention policy than channel messages within a team, on the assumption that they don't want to have one-to-one or one-to-group chat messages discoverable, but that the channel messages are really related to the work of the team, and they should be preserved at the same retention schedule as the documents that they're likely to be most related to. So all of these decisions are things that you're going to make about how you want to classify both the team and the content on the team. And so as you think about that, you do want to think about the fact that compliance labels in Microsoft 365 are not the same as retention policies. Retention policies are configured separately, and they're based on your content, but a compliance label could apply to the team as a whole, and that will define things like, can we have guests? What can members do? Who can share? Those kind of things. Combined, you'll be able to create exactly what you need to do to align with both your regulatory and your organizational policies. So I'm going to stop and just make sure there aren't any questions about that. So now that we've configured our team and we've thought about what kind of compliance policies, and we've got naming conventions, and so we're really managing our environment. We've got everything kind of set up to be managed. The other thing we want to do is pay attention to what's going on. M is for monitoring. And in this case, this is something you should really think about. I think of monitoring as a governance activity. Not everybody does, but I think you also want to think about we need to be looking at what's going on. We need to look at how effective are the teams that we're using, how active are the people in the teams. Do we need to do an intervention to either delete the team because it's not being used, or teach people some new skills to make usage much more effective? So there are monitoring and auditing things that are available to the admin of the team's environment, but there are also things that individual admins of each team can be taking a look at to look at the health of their teams. So you need to think about what kind of monitoring are we going to do and who's going to do it, or of whose job will it be to pay attention to that. There's quite a bit of analytics that you can get about teams. And I think, again, there's analytics that you'll look at for teams as a whole. But I also want to think about how will we empower the owner of a team to understand what kind of things are going on in the teams for which they are the team's admin or the team's owner. And so there's things that we can be looking at to understand how, the health and activity of our team. So these are just a few of the things that you can look at, and there's a link in the slide deck where you can look at the kind of information available to each individual team owner. So things that you can look at organizationally, and then things that we can encourage team owners to look at to ensure that their teams are healthy. And no matter what, whether you are provisioning via a form or a request, or whether you are provisioning where everyone can provision their own, the key to a successful governance deployment is training and communications. So T is for training and communications, and we need to think about how are we going to empower everyone in the organization to be as effective as they possibly can with teams, but how can we manage what we're teaching them so that we're not making their heads explode because we're giving them too much guidance all at the same time? I think for the most part, if you can build in your best practice recommendations into the team's templates, you will get people started on the right foot. But I also think that you want to give people sort of micro learning experiences so that if they want to learn about an individual part of teams, they can do that inside teams where they're already working. And so I really think it's important that no matter what we're doing to automate any of this, that we also think about what the end user needs in order to be most effective. I'm not a developer. I care about the real people in our organization. I think we can deploy Microsoft Learning Pathways and then bring it into Teams so that people have a playlist of tasks. We'll be able to use eventually all the different modules of Viva to encourage training. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the right people get the right information at the right time and know what to do in order to be most successful. And so, among other things, a lot of my clients have created short, customized quick start guides with screenshots from their organization that they typically will adapt from Microsoft resources. There's always a risk when you put a screenshot of anything into this cloud-based world that your screenshot will get out of date pretty quickly. But again, to jumpstart your process and make people feel like the training is targeted to them, it wouldn't be a bad idea to give people a basic set of here's the kind of things we know you're going to want to do, but targeted just for your organization and what you know people want to learn. One great way of doing this, of course, is, as Dwayne suggests, having a champions network for teams and encouraging that network to share what they know with their colleagues. What I really hope you don't do is take anything that we've talked about so far and create a governance document. This is what a typical governance document looks like. It's a big fat doorstop that no one wants to read. I mean, forget it. Actually, no one does read it. And all that does is result in frustrated, unhappy users. And I think that if you really want to be effective, you need to build governance right into the tools that you're using. And where you can't, you want to make sure that you are providing users with the right kind of training and guidance in the tools that they have in order to get work done. So I've said a prayer to the demo gods, and I am going to pray that I can actually show you an example of what this might look like. Let's see. I do it. I didn't give it big enough sacrifice. Hang on. Okay. So this is an example of a the User Resource Center for Microsoft 365 that I typically build with all of the solutions that I create. This is built as a SharePoint communications site in SharePoint, of course. And so what's super exciting, you'll notice that in my tenant, I do have the app bar. I also have a home site. And because I have those two magical things, the app bar and a home site, I'm able to deploy my intranet, which I'm representing as a gift because I believe that global navigation was a gift that Microsoft just gave to me. And my intranet, which I've given it a very fancy name called the intranet, I've been able to bring my intranet into Teams. So this is the web-based view of Teams, but if I was in the Teams desktop, I am using the new PowerShell script from Viva Connections to bring my intranet into Teams. My intranet, it has global navigation, but it also has my User Resource Center featured prominently front and center. And when I click on this, I am now at the front door of the User Resource Center that we were just looking at. I have a page addressing what I think people are probably most interested in my tenant, but for the experience related to Teams, I've got navigation to support that, as well as a quick little I need to area where someone can say, I want to get started with Teams. This page can be brought into any team in your template. So, or any team that you create. This is just a standard SharePoint page where you can add it as a tab in Microsoft Teams. You could also create an app in Microsoft Teams that is just about the User Resource Center. And here's an example of that. I'm going to probably disable this at some point because I think that the experience in Viva Connections is much better because I'm, of course, not getting any navigation, which is one of the benefits of Viva Connections, that it brings not only your SharePoint site, but the navigation for your SharePoint site into Microsoft Teams. Unfortunately, it's got a few little bugs. And so while it is bringing in the navigation, I lost my anchor links on pages. So it's got its good and its bad thing. But the whole idea is that each one of these pages is a topic specific page that addresses a unique thing that somebody might want to do. So the general governance for Microsoft Teams is here. There's another page for Teams training, and that sort of divides up the world to tell you all the different things you can do with Teams. I can also bring a playlist from Learning Pathways onto this page so that I don't have to manage and maintain this by myself. But since my site actually preceded Microsoft Learning Pathways, I'm actually using the same content that Learning Pathways does. And so that I can sort of choose every time I deploy this, how do I want to connect the training environment. But the idea is to deliver the training and the governance information side by side in the same site. Because one of the things that you will never get anyone to do is go look up, ooh, what's the governance for this particular process in Teams? What they will do is look up, how do I do this? While you're telling someone how to, you should also tell them how should. Because this is why the Microsoft training may not totally work for you, because all they can tell you is how to do a task that you may or may not be allowing in your environment. So by combining your how should with the appropriate how to, you can create a custom or bespoke experience for your users to give them just what they need in your environment at the moment that they need it. And that's really, I think, one of the beautiful things about deploying Viva Connections to your Teams environment is now if people are working in Teams, they have the benefit of not only the entire intranet, but the User Resource Center that you created for them right in the space that they're working. And search, of course, is going to respect both locations. So if you search for Teams, you can actually notice how it's saying search. I'll spell the whole word out. It's saying press enter to view all results. That's actually going to show you the content that is in the Teams environment, so messages and chat. But if you say team in the intranet, it's actually going to execute that search across the entire intranet. And so you have these two search scopes that are right built in already to the experience. And you didn't have to do any coding magic. And this is available to anyone who has the app bar in their tenant and has a home site. And the minute you have both of those things, you can run the PowerShell script that Microsoft has provided, and it's not very complicated. I will say I had to do it 3 times before I got it completely correct, but that's mostly because I didn't have the right size for my icon. So super clear, it was very straightforward, and I'm not a developer, so if I can figure out how to do it, I think anybody can. So just to kind of wrap this up, what I just showed you was a training and governance all in one place. It's the place where we want people to learn about what you can do and what you should do. A bunch of different pages that are highly topic specific. So maybe you'll have one page on meetings so that if someone searches for start a meeting, they'll get right to the page that they want, that you want them to get to, and they're not wading through an entire book on Microsoft Teams just to learn how to start or create a meeting. What I do to bring all the content together is the pages in SharePoint have metadata so that I can roll up all the content related to Teams, because every page has 4 pieces of metadata. What kind of a page am I? Am I an overview of a service, or am I guidance? What topic am I related to? What Microsoft app do I relate to? Let's see, 1, 2, 3. And who am I targeted for? Am I for the owner of a team, or am I for an end user? So you can create combinations of views of all of your assets dynamically using highlighted content or using filters in the Pages library to show people just what's relevant for the role that they have in the organization. And ideally, you really want to deliver this just in times, just where I am, and that's really how it would look if delivered in the Teams app. So just to kind of sum up, governance for Teams really has, I think, 2 elements. The part that admins both control and manage, and the part that users have to experience, that the admins will create in order to create an experience for the user so that they can make the best decisions in the right context of their work. One thing to keep in mind, no matter how much you've spent time on this and how much you pay attention to it, is that you need to have a plan for change. Changes to Teams, changes to the training that you provide, updates to governance as you learn things that maybe will make you want to change how you do things. I will commit to you that I will keep the governance decision document updated. I pretty much have an update to make almost every single week. I pay attention to the Microsoft roadmap, so I know what's coming, and I typically update the document as soon as you can start making that decision, but you'll want to pay attention to that as well, because things are going to change. Let's see, there's a question. Nancy is asking, the pages you created were on a SharePoint communications site. 100%. The reason I do that is a team site is really designed for everyone who's a member of the team has edit rights. A communication site is designed for consumption, where a small number of people edit and a large number of people read. This training content, I want it to be highly curated and targeted and very focused and well written, so that it is really designed for consumption, and I only want a small number of people to be editing it. So it's really part of my intranet, but now that I can bring my intranet into Teams, I can really create that powerful Teams-specific experience. In the slide deck, you'll find a bunch of resources. Happy to answer questions. We have a few minutes now. Here's all the different ways, by the way, that you can find me and how to get connected to me. And I think you've probably been in other sessions there. Here's the QR code to provide feedback. So we have like 1 minute, and I think a few minutes before the next session starts. So if anyone has any specific questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them.
You can also raise your hand if you'd like, and we'll
Oh, yeah,
unmute you.
hand raising. That works too. Oh, come on. No one has any questions? What's the biggest governance issue for teams? Thanks, Frederick. I don't know that I could answer that there's just one biggest governance decision for teams, but I do think fundamentally the first getting started question for teams that you need to resolve first is the provisioning question. I've spent a lot of time in a lot of organizations over the past year helping them wrestle with the enormous number of teams that they allowed to be created just to get started when everyone moved to work from home. And now they are retroactively going back and saying, oh my gosh, we shouldn't have done that because the number of abandoned teams in our tenant is far too many that we can manage. And so I'm in one organization right now that is going to put the kibosh on it starting next week. And they are in the process of contacting all the owners of what looks like abandoned teams to get them deleted. And so I do think that the first decision that you really do want to think about, how are we going to provision teams and what is the right approach for our organization? And it doesn't have to be that you make your final decision up front. But one of the things I've learned is it's much easier to relax a restriction than to impose a restriction. So I think that for me would be just kind of, if you can nail that decision, you will find your life a little easier. And of course, the biggest problem with locking it down, the easiest way to lock it down is that you are also going to lock down the creation of Yammer communities. So be prepared to have a way to get communities and teams created if you are going to lock it down. So I don't have an opinion either way. I can argue really effectively with myself on both sides of that issue. And Nancy saying,
Or
sorry, what level access do you need to do the thing you said you figured out? Was it a PowerShell thing? I'm not sure what you're referring to. I think I was talking about how to bring your intranet into Teams. So there is Microsoft, deploying Viva connections. And so, okay, so I can actually find the slide where I can stick the document. I can stick the link to the documentation that I used to do that. It is, you need to obviously have access rights to your tenant, but it was really not complicated. So let me grab that. Why can't I do that? All right, I'm going to grab that slide and then I'll put the link in the chat. It's very, very well written documentation, extremely clear. And as I said, for me, the thing that was the hardest was figuring out how to make an icon. You need a 32 by 32 icon. And when I tried it the first time, I didn't realize that the tool I was using to generate the icon was putting padding. And so I was requesting output 32 by 32, but I was getting this teeny, teeny, tiny icon because it had padding around the icon. So, okay. Joe is asking, you find yourself in a knowledge-hungry group of employees, built up a community where there's active engagement. How would you elevate leadership? First, leadership care. We can just keep going and lead ourselves, but sometimes there are roadblocks. Oh my gosh. That is a great question. Probably not one I can answer in a minute or two, but I often talk about sort of what's the way to get past roadblocks in the organization when there's an organization blocker. And years ago, I read an article about sort of the importance of key influencers in the organization. And obviously, we know who some of them are. They're the top-down leaders, but there's also these people that are like T-shaped managers or T-shaped individuals that have broad tentacles into the organization. Key influence, but they're not necessarily influencers, but not necessarily in positions of leadership. And in general, when those key influencers are on board for using a tool with an attitude, promoting an idea or a concept or an initiative, lots of people will follow them. That's the whole point of their big, broad, T-shaped influencer. So rather than necessarily going after the leadership, I often look for the T-shaped influencers, and you really know who they are because every organization has them. A consultant coming in from the outside, I rarely, as a consultant, know who these people are until I've spent a lot of time in an organization. But people in the organization know who these people are. These are the people sort of you want them on board. And once they're on board with your idea or your concept or your promotion, they will help you drive success, because nothing drives success like successful implementations. So if we have a team that's super successful using Teams and using it the right way and having all of their meetings and being able to get access to them after the recordings, a successful teams make other successful teams want to be like them. I call that the when Harry met Sally kind of approach. I'll have what she's having. And so I think really that's what we're looking for.
That was a great answer. Thank you.
You're welcome. I
Joe and I work together, so that was a loaded question for the record. So.
got it. Oh no. All right. Well, I hope I did a good job on that one.
Oh, it was perfect.
It's less of a governance and more of an adoption question. And this is the thing I always talk about, how the fact that governance, training, adoption, and information architecture go together. And if you have crappy information architecture, your users will have a crappy experience. And I don't care how much governance you will have crap that is found. And therefore, people won't trust anything about what you're doing. And so you really do want to think about all of these things together. They really go part and parcel together. So here's a question from Catherine. We've rolled out Teams due to COVID. What do you recommend to think of regarding governance now that we want to create an intranet? Because you've addressed the same names of teams in the intranets. Oh yeah, guess what? Okay, so you are going to have the naming convention conflict. So there's a couple things you can do. When you're creating intranet sites, be very, very careful before you click the part that actually creates the sites, because what you don't want to create is IT2, especially when it's a brand new intranet site. It's just going to look weird and people aren't going to know what the heck you're doing. And it's not that everyone pays attention to the URL, but when it's new, you want it to be nice and clean and fresh and beautiful. So the first thing you're going to do, if what I would have done if I could have, if let's just say flash back a year, what I would have done is I would have, even if I'm not ready to build my intranet in Microsoft 365, I would have made a land grab for the key functional names that I know I'm going to need. Information technology or IT or IS, whatever you call it, talent and development, human resources, or HR, site/HR, site/travel, site/finance, site/admin, like create all of those sites, even if you're not ready to use them. Now those names that namespace isn't available to someone who wants to create a team. From a naming convention perspective, if teams are open, I always recommend that you stick the word team in the team if it's not obvious. So if I could have flashed back and said to IT, why don't you create IT team? Because then it's very clear that that URL is for people who work in IT, as opposed to IT or the longer information technology, which is where you're going to post and publish the content that you want everyone to consume. So I think you do want to look back at your names, but again, that ship has sailed. I do not recommend going back in and changing the name of teams that are in play, productive, and everybody is happy. I don't think there's much use to doing that. Let those teams retire when they're ready to retire, and just don't worry about it. Move on with your life. There's so many other things to worry about. Instead, have a naming convention for a going forward status, and just be very careful. When you create a site, SharePoint will tell you if that URL has already been used, but it's going to make up a name for you if you're not looking at it. So just pay attention when you're creating your comm sites. First, do a search and if you're doing it from the admin center, make sure that there isn't a team already, and then have it as a going forward naming convention. Again, I think we want to just sort of decide where should we be spending our calories when it comes to governance. And I try to think of governance as being applied, think of it as kind of an impact related thing. If you can find a workaround and no kittens are going to die, then you know what? Just move on. I think there's other things you can do. If you were starting all over again from the beginning, sure, I'd tell you do it exactly this way. But we're all human. Things have happened. The ship has sailed. Let's keep productivity happening. Let's not do anything to destroy it. And let's just try to do a better job going forward.
I think it's time we get our group photo. If everybody wants to turn their camera on, we'll grab a picture in together mode for Susan's awesome session. I'll start. What scene would we like? It can be in the ocean, Minecraft. Here, this one's nice.
I would like us to be on a ski slope, to be honest
A
with
ski slope. That's a good one. There was some questions earlier about can we custom make these, and I was like, not yet, but
Not
that would be
yet.
awesome. The ship has sailed, and yeah.
That's a good one. That's a good idea.
I think that one might be the ocean one might be limited to it's 10. So all right,
Very
everybody.
tiny ocean.
Yeah. It's a very tiny ship. If everybody would give me a big smile on the count of 3, I will grab a picture of all of us. So 1, 2, 3. All right, thank you. I'll drop that in the chat if anybody wants their own copy. Send it to Walgreens, get it printed out, frame it. Awesome. Thank you, Susan, very much. I enjoyed that talk quite a bit. And very, very interesting. Governance is one of those, I like that you called it the G word. I think that's perfect.
I used to have this slide that I would put up because so many people associate it with a bad thing. And I would say, I'm going to do a little psychological experiment. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to break the pattern of thinking of governance as a bad thing. And I would ask people to stand up if they like Christmas. And, of course, everybody has to stand up. And then I would show a picture of a big giant G made out of a Christmas wreath with little bells and ornaments hanging off of it. And I would say, okay, now I want you to associate governance with Christmas. So now every time you hear the G word, you're going to think happy thoughts and going, oh, governance, this is such a great thing. It's just like Christmas. So there you go.
Scott's asking about the presentation. I think you linked your slides a little earlier. If you
I
could
did.
link that again,
I will.
that'd
I'm
be
going to put that
perfect. And
link.
then as far as the recordings go, those are going to be post-produced and uploaded to YouTube, and all attendees will receive a email notification about access to the recordings.
Okay. And there's the link again for anyone who missed it. So great. I think we can wrap up, and the slide deck has all my contact information. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and I'm happy to do my best to answer them.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.